Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Today, for our Tuesday-ism, I'd like for us to consider clericalism. Now, you may think that the reason I've chosen clericalism is because I've had church on the brain a little bit lately. I have had church on the brain a little bit lately as we're ramping up in preparation to start worshiping as Sovereign Grace Fellowship. I've been engaged in a lot of prep work for that, and so yes, I do have church on the brain. However, I come today to speak ill of clericalism. Now, you may not know the connection until you know what clericalism is. Well, clericalism is that understanding of the nature of the church that drives a deep and profound wedge between the layman and the clergy, seeing the clergy as set apart and distinct absolutely and completely, and in fact endowing the clergy as it were almost as a means of grace or a conduit through which God's grace flows. So the clericalist is the person who might take the position that the only person who could present the gospel and lead someone into the kingdom is a pastor, and that the pastor is the only one who should do this, and the pastor is the only one who should do that. The very first time that I was ordained to gospel ministry, this was back in 1996, and it happened through the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church. That particular meeting of the presbytery, when it ended, and this is common, I was invited to pronounce the benediction. Now, you may not even know what that is, but a benediction is a word of grace, a word of encouragement. We have the Aaronic benediction in Numbers chapter 6. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you his peace. That's the Aaronic benediction. Well, in Presbyterian circles, it is held that only the teaching elder has been given the authority to pronounce the benediction. That is a mildly clerical perspective. We tend in our day toward a much more flattening and a removal of distinctions. Clericalism is not a prevailing danger across the board in the evangelical church, but it can be a temptation when we are reacting against that flattening that is so common in our day. I know that, for instance, one of the things that people wrestle with is, well, who can read the Bible in a congregation? And there are those who get bent in knots whenever a woman reads a scripture text because women are not to serve and rule and reign in the church as ordained elders. They're not to be in positions of authority or to teach with authority. I believe that wholeheartedly, and yet that's not all the same thing as reading the scripture. You can make a connection symbolically. You can say, well, maybe we should only have elders read to remember their authority. I don't have a quarrel with that, but I do have a quarrel that says that if you don't follow that particular strategy, that somehow you're a bad person or a feminist or denying the reality of the distinction between elders and lay people. So that's one way you can push back in the other direction. That said, I do actually believe there are places where that symbolism can be helpful. Not necessary, but helpful. When you have, for instance, when you restrict the serving of the elements of the Lord's Supper to those who are elders, you are self-consciously connecting the authority of the church in its exercise of discipline with the authority of the church in the practice of the sacraments. That is, only those, or you could take the position that only those who can keep you from the Lord's table should invite you to the Lord's table. We should not be having the Lord's Supper by ourselves at home. We should not, in like manner, be doing baptisms by ourselves at home. That comes out of, again, an extreme low view of the church, or a low view of the office of the pastor. Now, there is a danger in that clericalism, that those who push back against that low view can be haughty, they can be prideful, they can look at the office as though the office is something that speaks well of them. You know, when you walk into the pulpit to preach, you're supposed to be afraid. You're not supposed to take the position, well, thank goodness I'm here. Okay? So clericalism is something you'll see especially in Episcopalian styles of churches, so that where the bishops have a great authority and lay people have very much less so. So on the one extreme, you'll have Rome circa 1500. On the other extreme, you will have the Anabaptist movement that was suspicious of any office. The reality is that the Bible teaches us of the office of elder, and it teaches us of the office of deacon, and it gives those offices specific callings and specific jobs, and they're not the same. It also doesn't say that those people who fulfill those roles are better Christians than those who do not. So let's be on our guard against clericalism, but let's also be on our guard against pushing for an egalitarianism in the church that doesn't reflect what the Bible itself teaches. It is perhaps the strangest thing in that profoundly strange book, 1984. George Orwell's world is haunted by Big Brother, by spies on every corner, and by memory holes through which the past disappears. It is, however, the 2 minutes hate that captured my attention. The citizens of 1984 every day joined together for a 2-minute period, were there to direct their hatred toward the enemies of the state. They are shown images on a television screen of Emmanuel Goldstein, a mythical opposition leader, and whatever supposed foreign enemy they are currently at war with. The state's goal, however, is not so much to create a frenzy against these enemies, but more to provide an outlet of the people's sublimated hatred of their own leaders. What may be stranger still is that this exercise in mass psychological warfare worked. The citizens didn't simply go through the motions to avoid getting into trouble with the law. Winston Smith, the story's protagonist, described it this way. He said, "The horrible thing about the 2 minutes hate was not that one was obliged to act a part, but that it was impossible to avoid joining in. Within 30 seconds, any pretense was always unnecessary. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness, a desire to kill, to torture, to smash faces in with a sledgehammer, seemed to flow through the whole group of people like an electric current, turning one even against one's will into a grimacing, screaming lunatic. And yet the rage that one felt was an abstract, undirected emotion which could be switched from one object to another, like the flame of a blow lamp. There is something profoundly contagious about group emotional experiences, but we need to understand that it need not be centered around hatred. In fact, often in our own day, that experience, that shared experience, is an experience of mourning. When a celebrity, if big enough, dies tragically and young, we seem to go through a national experience of catharsis. When JFK Jr.'s plane went down, the nation wept for days. This despite the fact that his most remembered life moment was when he was a little boy giving a farewell to salute to his fallen father. When Princess Di's car crashed, not just the nation, but most of the world put on figurative sackcloth. This despite the fact that she was no longer part of the royal family. And just a year or so ago, it was Kobe Bryant. Now, please don't misunderstand me. In noting this cultural phenomena and exploring it, I am not in the least seeking to diminish the tragedy for those involved. Kobe Bryant had a wife who lost a husband and a daughter. He had surviving children who lost a sister and a father. There's no question that it's heartbreaking. But it's not our heartbreak. Neither his fame, nor his talent, nor the championship banners he brought to Los Angeles make him ours. Oddly, when we pretend that these things make him ours, we not only don't honor him, but we dishonor him. Kobe Bryant was good at playing basketball. Beyond that, I know nothing of the man. I have no closer a connection to him than I do to Michael Jordan or LeBron James or Zion Williamson. But Kobe Bryant was, just like everyone else on that helicopter, a real person with real family and real friends. His tragedy should not be used for national catharsis. It belongs to them, the real family, the real friends. We shouldn't be trying to break into that inner circle. Crashing weddings is rude. Crashing funerals is disgraceful. Let us walk away from the 2 minutes mourn and leave the real mourners in peace. One of the things that seems to keep cropping up as I now enter into the third time we've done a segment in that series that we're calling Forever Friends is that just like last time when we looked at my friend Greg Thomas, the friend I'm going to look at today is very much like me. And our friendship began in the context of me going to a new school and entering into a different social structure, and also included a healthy level of competition, both academically and in terms of sports. Now, my very first friend that we covered was my friend Ted Bell, and I mentioned during that particular segment that several years ago I had the opportunity to travel back to Western Pennsylvania, and I had the blessing of sharing a meal with Ted and his wife. Well, on that same trip, I also had a meal with this friend that I'm about to speak about and his wife, who, by the way, also was a friend. I mentioned last time that 1st through 3rd grade I attended Cook Township Elementary School, and that my peers there were decidedly rural folk, that they were on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. They were coal miners and truck drivers and things of that sort. Well, around this time period, we happened to visit the local Episcopal church, and the headmaster of a private school was there, and he talked to my father about the wisdom of perhaps enrolling me in this private school. The private school is called the Valley School of Ligonier, and that school is housed in the former mansion of one of the Mellon clan, as in Carnegie Mellon University or Mellon Bank. And that school included a number of Mellons themselves. In fact, there was a Mellon in my class, a Mellon in the grade ahead of me, a Mellon in class two classes behind me. Mellons everywhere you turned. It was a regular Mellon patch. I mention all this because this is a radical change in culture. I was a middle-class suburban kid. First, I went to school with rural folks. Now, all of a sudden, I'm in a school where many of my peers are not middle class. They're not only wealthy, but they're old money. The Valley School was a feeder school for various and sundry private schools, prep schools, boarding schools that would in turn feed its graduates into Ivy League schools. That's the kind of place the Valley School was, where you had to wear a jacket and tie to class. We met once a week for chapel and recited Episcopalian liturgies. Well, in that class, as I came there in the 4th grade, my very first and best friend was Tim Caldwell. Now, Tim Caldwell was most certainly not middle class. Tim Caldwell's family was very well off, lived in a beautiful home on extensive acreage, but they were not old money. They were new money. Tim's father, I remember one day, probably on something of a whim, brought home a Corvette. My very first ride in a Corvette was in Tim's dad's Corvette. So Tim was a lot like me in this place where I wasn't middle class, although, of course, much more middle class in terms of culture, though much, much more wealthy than my family. And Tim was a good athlete, and Tim was a smart student, and Tim was just, again, a lot of fun. And we became best friends, and we also competed. I remember in the 6th grade, we didn't hand in our dittos to our teacher, but we did have to go through our math books. And I remember sitting beside Tim, and to my right in the front of the class was our math teacher, Mr. Hutzel, who was also our coach. Mr. Hutzel was our math teacher, and I'm seeing him over there. And to my left is Tim, and I'm literally not just watching what page he's on, but what number question he is on the page. Interestingly, Tim and I were not the top students in the class. There was another tier above us that was occupied by a couple of other young men, Bruno and Todd, and then right below then there was Tim and me. Well, Tim and I just became, he had a great interest in sports. In fact, the very first time I was blessed to attend a Steeler game was with Tim and his family. His family had season tickets to the Steelers, and he invited me to go along. And we actually watched the Steelers lose that particular year. They went on to win the Super Bowl, but they lost that game to, of all people, the New England Patriots, who had Jim Plunkett as their quarterback at the time and Sam the Bam Cunningham in the backfield. Anyway, Tim and I, we talked football, we talked baseball. We also, just like Ted and I, we competed against each other in Little League in baseball and our midget football leagues. And so, we had that in common. In addition, we competed with each other on the soccer field, though we were on the same team. We were among the first in our class to get sort of elevated to the varsity. We were the ones who were put in positions to score later in our careers there. Tim and I went on together to 9th grade at government school again, this time Lincoln Valley Junior High, and maintained our friendship there. It was during that year that his father passed away, and that was just really difficult for him, and I didn't really know how to help him as a 14-year-old, but we maintained our friendship, and then after that I went off to school, and he stayed there and eventually married, again, one of my good friends. I could probably find him, and maybe I will. I want to remember friends because they were a blessing. I want to thank friends because they were a blessing. I want them to know that the relationship that we had was valuable. So, Tim, if I can get this to you, thank you for being a friend. Thank you for listening to this, and thank you for meeting with me and with your wife that day there at the tavern. God bless you, brother. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com and join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.